And welcome everyone to this third and final session in our series on science and religion. I am going to go to the share screen, and now I'm going to do something that may make you a little dizzy. I'm going to try and move. No, this is exactly the way I want it. Okay, so can everyone see where it says session 3A, does God care?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Great. And I have those of you who have your video on, I can see you on the screen. If you want to ask questions, you can wave frantically, you can just jump in, or you can raise your hand electronically. We covered some of this material last time, just a few slides, so I'm going to go through it rather quickly to get up to where we are now. But one of the things I do want to emphasize is that the YouTube of actually the first two sessions is available on my website. You click on classes, and I've now put both of our first two sessions there, and after tonight I will put the third session. And also copies of these slides are in a 3-session class are available on my website. So as I mentioned over and over again, I believe that I have two leaps of faith associated with God and religion. My first leap of faith is the question of, does God exist? And that was really the subject of last time's session. And there I would say, as far as I'm concerned, although I still think it's a matter of faith, for me the scientific evidence is overwhelming that there is some organized intelligence behind the creation of the universe and humanity. Reasonable people can disagree on this, and that's why we call it faith, or I call it a leap of faith. That's leap of faith number one. Leap of faith number two is the question of, does God care? If God cares, and I think I was kind of used two extremes. Does God care whether I have a turkey or ham for dinner? That would be, the laws of keeping kosher. And at the other end of, I would say, the moral extreme, does God care whether I am kind to babies or torture babies? If I presume, and as you'll hear, as I get through this, I will say I believe God cares. I don't find much scientific evidence for God caring. So for me, that is a true leap of faith. But now, proceeding from that assumption or presumption that God cares, if God cares, then God would communicate God's caring, which we would understand as revelation. So I would say, if God cares, then God would communicate what God cares about. And for Jews, for other religions, we call that communication revelation. So as we talked about to a degree last week, for Jews, the issue is, this is what happened at Sinai. Sinai is the primary moment of revelation. For very traditional Jews, Judaism teaches that God revealed not only the 10 Commandments, but the entire Torah, the written Torah, and the oral Torah to Moses. But as we started discussing last week, I would suggest and believe that Revelation, the written text that we have, is imperfect because it was written down by human beings. And I went through this little exercise, what do you see? And most people will say a cube or a box, but really what you see, since you're all looking at this on a screen, are light dots and dark dots. And we infer that it's a cube. And psychologists tell us that something like 90% of what we see is conditioned by our culture and expectations. So there's much of Torah and Bible and Jewish tradition that I find to be horribly immoral. And so I don't believe that was actually what God was saying. Then I went through a little exercise, which I'm not going to belabor, which points out that even what we can see is only a very small fraction of the electromagnetic world out there. And as I said last time, it's a good thing, because if we could each perceive every cell phone conversation that is in the air around you, every radio station, every TV station, we would go a little nuts. So it turns out we can only perceive a very small fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. So the issue then is, what do we do with revelation? Particularly, what do we do if you count yourself in a Reformed Jewish camp, or I would say anything other than a fundamentalist religious camp? And so my take on this is to take Torah seriously, but not literally. Is there anyone who is not familiar with the story of the boy who cried wolf? It doesn't appear in every culture, so I always like to ask that question, but I think most of you know it. And I can't remember if I got to this, I don't think I got to this part last time. But, suppose I were to ask, did that story actually happen? Was there actually a boy who, 3 times cried wolf and so on? We can have a debate about it, but I think you would agree, if I could prove that the story never happened, that the lesson of the story would still be significant. I think we did discuss this. And that's true. So ultimately, let's see if this works. Oh yeah, it worked. Oh, sorry. So science books and history books, I don't look at Torah and Revelation as a science text or a history text. So if we find clever, if we look at the text really hard and find all sorts of clever and interesting problems in the text, they're not that hard to find. The classic one was Cain murders his brother Abel, and then we hear that Cain gets married. Well, where did his wife come from? So did he marry his sister? Was it incest? Did he marry somebody else? Where did she come from? What family, and so on? One answer is the Bible just is simply not interested in that. And if it were a history textbook or a science textbook, that would be a glaring flaw. But the Bible is not a history textbook. It's not a science textbook. And, as I pointed out, if you have history textbooks and science textbooks, they are obsolete relatively quickly. The Bible, written somewhere between 2,500 years ago and 2,000 years ago, roughly, is still very much relevant to many, you could argue, most of the people of the world. So I read Torah both literally and figuratively. Jewish tradition teaches us to dig for deeper meanings. There's something called pardes. Pardes is a word that actually comes from the Greek. It can mean an orchard, a garden, or it's the root of the word paradise. So Judaism teaches we're supposed to take every part of Torah and at least examine it through 4 different interpretive lenses. Through the pshat, the simple or literal meaning of the text; through remez, a hint or suggestion; drash, an insight to draw out a story from the text; and sod, mystery. Another tradition, if 4 isn't enough for you, teaches that there are 600,000 interpretations of every Torah text. Why? Because there were 600,000, adult men present at Sinai. And so one tradition says everyone heard something slightly different. So our job is to recover the 600,000 different versions. So I love to read Torah at least in 2 very, very different ways. Traditionally, through the eyes of the rabbis, the mystics, the traditional commentators, Talmud, Midrash. What did Rashi say about this? When I study Rashi, I'm reading the words of a brilliant Torah scholar who lived 1,000 years ago, roughly speaking. I'm interested in what he has to say. I'm interested in what my teacher at HUC had to say, last week in a Torah commentary. I'm interested in knowing what the rabbis 1,500 years ago had to say. I also like to read it scholarly. What do people who are possibly secular scholars, Christian scholars, Muslim scholars, atheistic scholars have to say about the text as they find it? And, for those of you who've studied this text, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail, know that in the Torah itself, we can identify at least 4 separate voices. They refer to God in different ways. They seem to be worrying about different things. One is the J that calls God by Yud He Vav He, the E calling God as Elohim, a priestly text, and Deuteronomy, which scholars would say was written much later, probably 6th, 7th century BCE, probably several hundred years later than this text, or at least separately, has a very different take on these matters. And I base some of this in a very analogous situation in physics. So listen to Einstein speaking on this. It seems as though we must sometimes use the one theory and sometimes use the other. He's talking about understanding light as a wave or understanding light as a particle. We are faced with a new kind of difficulty. We have two contradictory pictures of reality. Separately, neither of them fully explains the phenomenon of light, but together they do. And I've emphasized that last element. So for me, studying Torah through literalist eyes, through, I would say, pious eyes, through the eyes of the rabbis of our tradition, that gives me insights. And studying it as a scholar would study the text also gives me insight. And I find, joy and wonder in both. Let me talk about this. So, for example, a question is, was the universe created in 6 days, 5,780 years ago? Or was the universe created over a course of some 13 billion years? So, if I read the text, the Torah text, in an allegorical way, I'm not so much focusing on it as a science textbook. I would say the creation story is teaching us about the nature of God and the nature of humanity. And I may have mentioned this in one of the earlier sessions. One of the distinctive features of our creation myth, as represented in the first book of Genesis, is that it's a quiet, purposeful creation. Whereas Babylonian myths and other myths have gods fighting with each other and slashing open dragons, and humanity kind of pops out as a casualty of war. Whereas in our text, the creation is purposeful. Certain things are happening each day. They are happening at the will of God. And at the end, the culmination of this process is the creation of humanity. But you might take it literally. I didn't bring that up. There's a book written by an Orthodox Jewish astrophysicist who would say the universe was created both in 6 days and in 13 billion years. And we're not making the argument that one day in God's sight is like, 2 billion years. What he would say is 6 days in God's inertial, this is using special relativity. And if anybody is really dying to get a deeper explanation of this, I would be happy to explain time dilation and special relativity. It'll take 5 or 10 minutes. We can do it after the class. What he would say is 6 days in God's inertial reference frame is literally the same as 13 billion years in Earth's reference frame, according to the theory of relativity's teaching about time dilation. And we know time dilation is a fact. In thousands of ways, we know this. It's not a theory. So this is actually the author I was mentioning, Gerald Schroeder. So one of the insights from Gerald Schroeder is, and I love to talk about this in the class I teach about Hebrew, is the first letter of the Bible is the letter Bet. And one teaching about the letter Bet is it's open only on the left side. It's closed on the top, it's closed on the bottom, it's closed on the right. So one kind of mystical teaching about the letter Bet is all knowledge flows in this direction, which is, of course, the way the direction Hebrew goes. So one of the reasons the Torah begins with the letter Bet is to remind us that we can't ask about what happened before the creation of the universe. And cosmology actually teaches, cosmology teaches us the same thing. You can't ask what happened before the Big Bang. That question doesn't have any meaning. Time begins with the Big Bang. And Schroeder actually goes through the 6 days of creation and ties it to cosmology. So just to give an example, if you read in Genesis in chapter 1, God says, let there be light, and there was light. So if we were watching this from some distance, everything would be black, and all of a sudden there would be a burst of light. And if you think about what happened in the creation, according to Big Bang, in the initial stages of the creation of the universe, all the matter, and energy for that matter, is concentrated in a relatively small area with enormous gravitational force. The gravitational force is so large that light can't escape. It's what we call a black hole. So it's a giant black hole. Now with the expansion energy and velocity, we get to the point where gravity is no longer strong enough to hold in the light, and yehi or, and there is light. Schroeder goes back and talks a lot about Nachmanides. Nachmanides, I think, is a 13th century somewhat mystical commentator talking about Genesis 1:1. So just listen to Nachmanides for a moment. At the briefest instant following creation of all the matter in the universe was concentrated in a very small place, no larger than a grain of mustard. The matter at this time was so thin, so intangible, that it did not have real substance. It did have, however, a potential to gain substance and form and become tangible matter. From the initial concentration of this intangible substance in its minute location, the substance expanded, expanding the universe as it did so. As the expansion progressed, a change in the substance occurred. This initial thin and non-corporeal substance took on tangible aspects of matter as we know it. From this initial act of creation, everything that has existed or will ever exist was, is, and will be formed. So at least Nachmanides sounds a lot like cosmology. So I kind of teased you with the idea that I've only found one idea in nature that is what I would consider to be scientific evidence for God's caring. And I'll be really interested in knowing whether it convinces any of you. It's the total solar eclipse. And I went to see the solar eclipse that occurred, I think it's 2 or 3 years ago. To show you what kind of nut I am, I reserved the motel room in Madras, Oregon, 2 years before the eclipse, because Madras, Oregon, being on the eastern slope of the Cascades, was statistically the best place in the country to view this eclipse in terms of probability of no cloud cover. You want to see what a total eclipse looks like? If there's a lot of cloud cover, close your eyes. That's what it looks like. You don't have to travel halfway around the world to see it. But the astounding thing to me, the thing that was awesome, and I try not to use that word lightly, is the angular size of the moon. So this is kind of the way it looks. I can't remember which direction it was. Here's the moon, and slowly the moon is just covering up the disk of the sun until it's absolutely perfect. The angular size of the moon, as viewed from the Earth, is exactly the same as the angular size of the sun for many eclipses. Not all of them, but for many of them. That's because the moon, I think the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, but it's also 400 times further away. So it matches exactly. And I got these great pictures from a true nerd who was with this little group watching. And so because it matches exactly, you can see this corona. And you go from sunlight, because even when you have these crests, there's a lot of light out there. And you go from that to this in an instant, and the light level here is about that of a full moon. So you go from day to night almost instantly. And it sits like that for 3 or 4 minutes. And people were applauding. I thought that was hysterical. People were applauding. But the most hysterical thing was here when it started emerging again, cars were starting up and everybody was leaving. I mean, this part takes like an hour and a half, but people said, well, that's it. You know, we want to beat the traffic. And also, just before totality, because there's craters on the moon, you know, little bits of sunlight are showing through. And I don't know if I can do that. No, I can't do it on that screen. You can even see little prominences. You see a little red there. There are flares of the fusion energy of the sun glowing. I found that awesome.
Is that what they call Bailey's beads?
These are Bailey's beads, yes. There's no reason that this coincidence should take place. People will sometimes come to me and they will say, Rabbi, look how beautiful the flowers are. You know, God must exist because of the beauty of these flowers. And I smile and nod. But deep in my heart, I'm thinking about flowers can be beautiful so they attract insects to pollinate. And there's good Darwinian reasons for many of the phenomenon, you know, that we see that are of great beauty. But there's no inherent, maybe a sunset, actually beautiful sunset is another one. I'll have to think about that. But there's no reason on Earth or off the Earth why this coincidence should exist. I consider this evidence of a gift from God. I'm just curious if anybody agrees with me.
Oh, Rabbi, this is Larry.
Yeah.
The thing I need to hear from you is the explanation as how it's evidence for God caring. I can understand the argument that it's evidence of God existing.
No, that any object in light casts a shadow. The idea that the moon will cast a shadow on the earth, ho-hum. You cast a shadow, I cast a shadow. The fact that the spatial orientation of the moon, the sun, and me is such that the disks are exactly the same size, and I can see this. And by the way, get experimental proof of Einstein's general theory of relativity. That might take another 10 minutes. That's a gift. There's no reason why it should be that way. If the moon were, you know, another 10% further away, you would never see any of this. The sun would just get completely black. If the moon were 10% closer, you would see a big circle. The fact that it's perfect.
I hear you, but I don't understand how that goes to the issue of caring.
This is a gift. Seeing this sight was an awesome gift. And I can't think of any reason why it happened except God loves me and wanted to share this amazing thing with me. Look what I'm going to do for you. Abracadabra. So, have I convinced anybody? I'm just curious.
No.
Okay, perfect. My record is perfect.
I don't think that just the idea of a solar eclipse is the gift. Of seeing that is the gift. I consider the gift that we're here to see anything at all is the gift.
I'm with you, but you can explain through Darwinian evolution why we're here.
The amazing thing is that we walked on that moon.
That's also pretty amazing, but I won't necessarily invoke it as evidence of God's existence. For me, I can't think of any other reason why this should occur other than God loves me. But I haven't convinced anybody else, so I will not dwell on it.
Well, Darwinian evolution, that's a gift too. The fact of life itself on this earth is a gift.
Yes, but I don't.
Let's go back to the universe itself is a gift, and the fact that we're here to observe it is a gift, including the solar eclipse.
Right. So the existence of the earth for me and the existence of life is evidence, this was last week, of God's existence, of an organizing intelligence in the universe. What I'm interested in now is the question of whether that organizing intelligence cares a whit about me. And I don't find any evidence except for the eclipse. And I just like to show off my pictures of the eclipse because I'm clearly not convincing anybody else. Okay, moving right along. So the biggest question for me behind the question of God caring is the existence of evil and tragedy in the world. So I want to discuss that. And for some of you who've studied other things with me, this will sound familiar. So there's really two issues. One is human evil, and the other is tragedy. Evil, I would assert, is a consequence of human free will. The question is not where was God at Auschwitz? The question is where was humanity at Auschwitz? And we're going to spend a little time on something called the Milgram experiment, talking about human propensity to just do evil. There's the idea of free will is underlined in a couple of different places in Jewish sources. In the Mishnah, it says everything is foreseen, yet free will is given. Another place in the Talmud, I can't cite the source, is that says that everything is in the hands of God except for fear or awe of God, fear or awe of heaven, Yirat Hashemayim. And God, you know, in text that we read from the Torah on Yom Kippur, says, "This day I call the heaven and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live." If it was all in God's hands, God would not be invoking upon us and asking us to choose life and blessings and not death and curses. Tragedy is a larger problem, which we will discuss. I want to spend a little bit of time on the Milgram experiment. And again, this is pretty small, but basically what you have is a psychological experiment done in the 60s with 3 players. You have the tester, the experimenter, and then you have 2 people supposedly chosen at random, in this case from the community around Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. And one person is going to be the teacher, and the other person is going to be the learner. And what they choose their roles, you know, by lot, out of a hat. But the thing is fixed, so that the only person that's really being tested is the teacher. The learner is a shell. He is an actor. He's put behind a screen, and the teacher is told by the professor, we're going to do an experiment in memory. I'm going to give you word pairs like dog, cat, you know, fast bird, tall mountain. And the learner has to repeat them back. If the learner makes a mistake or doesn't respond at all, the learner will get a shock. And this was the device put in front of the teacher. There are toggle switches. And actually, I'm going to show a video. I've never shown a video of this. But if you want to see some really interesting things, Google Milgram experiment videos. Because what I didn't know is this experiment has been repeated recently in England. And they got the exact same results, except now the videos are in color with lots of video on the learner. It's very interesting. So if the person made a mistake, the teacher would hold down a switch as long as he wanted to give the learner a shock. And if they kept making mistakes, they would go higher and higher and higher. And as you can see, the description, first they have the voltage level. The description goes from intense to extreme intense to danger to XXX, whatever that means. So here's a little bit of video. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but I want to kind of jump to the end. For one thing, it's kind of interesting.
With 15 volts, and you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
Travis, I'll call on you in a second.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Dance.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 330.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let me
Dance.
out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30.
Ow!
The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of here.
boy.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me out.
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
So, yeah, Travis, you had your hand.
Okay, well, I actually show this documentary in one of my classes. I teach Western civilization, and one of the questions I asked my class is, do they think that something like Nazi Germany could ever happen again? And a lot of them tell me that they think that this is kind of an outdated or an old study, and that they don't believe with the decades of level of education over the decades that this could be ever simulated again. So I was curious. I never heard about the modern study.
Yeah, just Google. I just came across it, and I was tempted to show the modern one, except I really wanted to show Milgram and the
I was
authentic
under the
set.
impression it's illegal to now to do these kind of research studies.
It was in England.
So they have different laws. Okay.
Yeah. So the other thing which is worth pointing out is the response of the learner was recorded. So in order to make all of the tests equivalent, every learner heard the exact same response. I'm sorry, every teacher who was administering the shock heard the exact same response. So this is the result. Every participant was willing to go up to 135 volts, and 65%, as they mentioned, were willing to go to 450 volts. And that was true in the modern recreation of the study. 2/3 of the people were willing to go to the modern one. And, they interviewed in one of the videos I saw, and they said, one of the guys who was not willing, he basically said, I'm out of here. I'm just not doing this anymore. And they interview everyone afterwards. And of course, they tell the people that the person wasn't really getting a shock. And that was his response. He said, this is Nazi Germany. How could people do this?
Yeah, these are people with like PhDs, master's degrees. They did a wide variety of people with different education.
Wide variety, men and women the same. You might think women wouldn't do it.
Right.
Here's another slight take on it, which I find very interesting. So here's the original setup. 65% of people were willing to go to the 450 volts. If it was in an office building instead of a university setting, the number went down to 48%. If the teacher and the learner were in the same room, the person being shocked and the person administering the shock were in the same room, it was 40%. If the teacher was holding his hand on top of the learners on this electrical plate, it went down to 30%. If the experimenter leaves and just tells him to do the test, the number going up to the maximum level was 23%. If, it gives order by phone. If an ordinary person gives order by phone, it's 20%. If a teacher sees other people rebelling and leaving and has some sense that it's okay to do so, it went down to 10%. And if the teacher chooses the shock level rather than just going up in steps, it went down to 3%. So it's a very interesting study. Suffice it to say, the point that Travis raises, I think, is exactly right. These are ordinary people. There was no guns, there was no war, there was no history of anti-Semitism. The only issue was authority, was that there was someone in a white coat saying this is part of the experiment, and the rules of the experiment say you need to go on. And it's really interesting. Watch the English experiment, Travis, because you see the people arguing with the experimenter and asking questions like, well, this is not my responsibility, right? I mean, or he agreed, he signed a waiver. People are asking questions like that. It's very interesting. Okay, so that's free will. Now I want to jump to what I think is a much more difficult issue, which is tragedy. And I'm going to give you a Jewish discussion of this issue. This is certainly not the Jewish discussion of the issue. It is the one that makes sense to me. And it's the one that really is the subject of this book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, by Harold Kushner. And just very briefly, Harold Kushner, young, new conservative rabbi with the first baby, Aaron. And very early on in Aaron's life, it's clear that Aaron is not well, and he has a disease called progeria. And the disease progeria is a rapid aging, and Aaron dies at age 14. So Rabbi Kushner is asking the question that we would all ask, namely, how could a good, loving, powerful God allow this to happen? What could Aaron have possibly done wrong to merit this? So this is the underlying logic. By the way, this is in a very real sense a commentary on the book of Job, and I'll bring up the book of Job again. I heard Ed Feinstein talk about this. Ed Feinstein, an amazing rabbi in the valley, in the San Fernando Valley, Beth Shalom. And he put it in a way which I think made it easier, at least for me to follow. So what I am saying is, according to the rules of logic, this is now not theology, this is logic. At least one of these statements must be false. God is all good and all just. God is all powerful, and bad things happen to good people. Briefly, if God is all good and all just and all powerful, if a bad thing happens to a good person, then God wasn't just, if God really was in control. So this is just logic. You can say there is no God, in which case we don't have any problems. If bad things happen to you, sorry. Or that they're all false. That's another possibility, but at least one must be false. So let's look at each of them separately. Assume, number one, God is all good and all just is false. This is the God of the philosophers. It's the God of my leap of faith, number one. There's an organizing intelligence in the universe. The universe has been carefully crafted to allow for human life, allow for life at all, allow for a stable universe, allow for human life. These are the laws of physics. They don't care about Rabbi Kushner's son. They don't care about my son, right? They don't care about me. That's the God of the philosophers, or what the Greeks sometimes called the unmoved mover, God of the laws of physics. And by the way, in the book of Job, this is Job's conclusion. Very briefly, because we're going to come back to it, Job is a good guy. How do we know Job is a good guy? The narrator tells us Job is a good guy. So Satan, a prosecuting attorney kind of angelic creature, celestial creature, is in front of God, and God says, how about my boy Job? He is terrific. And Satan said, yeah, that's because he has it so good. So to condense the story, Job says, let's visit some horrible diseases on him and wipe out his family and his livelihood. And then we'll see if he's still loyal and faithful to you. And God empowers him to do it. And people talk about the faith of Job and the patience of Job. It lasts 2 chapters in a very long book. Job rants and rails against his fate, and specifically, he believes he's innocent. He believes that God is all powerful, but he absolutely doesn't believe that God is just. I'm going to jump to assumption number 3. Bad things happen to good people. This can be false in two ways. Maybe the thing isn't bad. Consider the world from the perspective of a baby who is about to get vaccinated against diphtheria, smallpox, chickenpox, and other things. From that baby's worldview, he's a good little baby, and all of a sudden now he has a pain in his tush. A bad thing has happened to a good baby. From our worldview, and I know that not everybody loves vaccinations. From my worldview, it's not a bad thing that happened to that baby. A miracle has happened to that baby. It's a very, very good thing. And indeed, I will talk to people who have gone through horrible events in their lives, and they come out the other end saying, while I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy, having gone through this experience has made me a deeper, more caring, more insightful person. And maybe this really wasn't a bad thing. Maybe God has some kind of a plan, and this looked bad to me, but it was really part of God's plan. So that's one way bad things happen to good people can be false. Maybe the thing really isn't bad, or maybe no one is really good. So in many Christian traditions, we have the concept of original sin, and I know some of you know a lot more about Christianity than I do. I do know there are 43,000 different Christian movements, and they certainly treat this issue differently. But another answer is we are all tainted with the sin in the Garden of Eden. No one is really good. If good things happen to us, that's an undeserved gift of grace from God. And if bad things happen to us, it's not because we were good people. That's a classic Christian take. By the way, a classic Jewish take in Kabbalah and in Chassidut, in the Hasidic beliefs and in mystical beliefs, there's a belief in reincarnation. And one explanation of bad things happening to good people is we are paying for sins that we committed in prior incarnations, or maybe we even allowed in our community. So why did 1.5 million children get murdered by the Nazis in Germany? Because Germany was where Reform Judaism began, and the community allowed Reform Judaism to begin, and therefore the German Jews were punished for this. So that's this take. Rabbi Kushner and I reject this. What happened to Rabbi Kushner's son, what happened to a loved one in your life and in my life is bad and is really bad. And I don't believe that no one is good. So I do believe that bad things happen to good people. That leaves us with the idea that God is all powerful may be false. And this is actually addressed in a couple of interesting places in the Talmud. My favorite one is a very well-known rabbinic story in the Talmud, and it turns out that there are two laws that if you follow them in the Torah, you are promised a long life. The first one is very well known to all of you. It says, honor your father and your mother. And the conclusion, in the Ten Commandments is, so that you may long live in the land that God is promising you. The second one is much more obscure. It says, when you take a baby bird or an egg from the nest, you should shoo away the mother bird, so that the mother bird won't see you taking the baby bird or the egg. And if you do so, you're promised a long life. So in the story, a father asks his son, take this ladder and climb up the tree and bring me down. I don't remember if it's baby birds or eggs. And the son says, yes, Dad, takes the ladder, climbs the tree, shoos away the mother bird, and takes the baby bird, fulfilling the commandment of honoring his father and fulfilling the commandment of shooing away the bird. On the way down, the ladder breaks and the child falls to his death. So now the rabbis are going to discuss, how is this possible? And one answer is, we don't believe the story really happened. And there's a discussion, no, Rabbi, whatever it is, Yossi or somebody said this, and we believe all of his stories. And then another rabbi says, wait a minute, I know. Maybe he was thinking evil thoughts when he was climbing the tree. And the rabbis say, the Aramaic equivalent of, give me a break. He was fulfilling commandments, and in Judaism, we don't punish people for thought crimes. We focus more on what you do. So the rabbis go round and round and round and round, and they finally come up with a brilliant Talmudic insight. The ladder was defective. And it broke, and he fell. There's another section in the Talmud that talks about nature operating according to its own laws. So it says, the text actually says, it would be just, dinhu, if when someone stole seeds and planted them, that they wouldn't grow. You figure a God that could create the universe could prevent stolen seeds from growing. But we know they grow. And they say it would be just if a couple commits adultery and the woman gets pregnant, that a child would not result from the pregnancy, because there's all sorts of problems with a child born from a forbidden union. But we know it happens. And the conclusion of the Talmud is nature operates according to its own laws. So you are a wonderful, pious person. You give to charity. You pray 3 times a day. You do all these great things. Put on your seatbelt. Don't text when you drive. Take your meds, because nature is going to operate according to the laws of nature. If some idiot shoots a bullet in the air, the path of that bullet is guided by my own old career, physics, not my new career, theology. God doesn't seem to intervene to just shove that bullet away from a nice person to a rotten person. The God who created the universe could have caused Mrs. Hitler to miscarry, so that little baby Adolf would never have been born. But that doesn't seem to be the way that God works in the universe. And this is the answer that makes most sense to me. So the next question you might ask is, who needs God? And Harold Kushner's written another book on it. By the way, Harold Kushner's written about a dozen books, and they're all fantastic. And basically what Rabbi Kushner argues, and what I agree with, is God's role is not as a puppet master, guiding things or controlling things, not guiding, controlling things. God's value, God's role, to Rabbi Kushner, to me, is as a teacher, inspirer, commander, friend, and companion. Let me say a little more about this. The question often arises, God, where have you been lately? You know, back in the good old days, God was splitting the sea. God was tumbling the walls of Jericho. God actually made the sun stand still in Jericho. That would screw with the eclipse quite a bit. In them good old days, God did all that stuff. Where have you been lately? So this is not an original idea, the idea of comparing God and God's role to that of a parent and a child. So let's talk about the parent and the growing child. In infancy, parents work miracles. A baby is crawling toward a hot, fireplace. All of a sudden, that baby is flying, placed in a crib. Some wonderful smelling powder is sprinkled on the baby. The baby had soiled diapers. Now, magically and miraculously, the baby has a clean diaper. When the baby looks up, there's these birds floating around and playing music. I mean, it's a miracle. In the world of an infant, parents work miracles. Now the baby grows a little bit, and the child is a toddler and walking around and playing in the front yard. And the parents tell the toddler, do not play in the street. If you play in the street, you could get hit. You will get hit by a car. Do not play in the street. The parent does not say, if you play in the street, there's a 10% chance a car may come along, and a 5% chance the driver may not see you, leading to a 0.5% chance that you could be hit by the car. No, it's very simple. Play in the street, hit by a car. Toddler. Adolescent. Child is growing older. So I'll tell you a story about my own relationship with my son when he was an adolescent. My son was an aspiring actor. Now he is an actor and does a lot in stage and actually in Prague. And when he just got his driver's license, we were living in Westlake Village, and he's very interested in acting, doing a lot of acting at Westlake High School. And he was invited to join an acting troupe in Hollywood. So he's all of 16, in 3 days or something, 16 and a half. And of course, the actors in Hollywood have day jobs because nobody's earning a living in this industry. And so the rehearsals are at night, starting like 8 o'clock at night, maybe going to 11 or 12. And so my son is all excited. He's been invited to join us. And he comes to me. And of course, I say no and explain, all the reasons. You're an inexperienced driver. It's at night, literally God knows what will happen. So do you think my son's response to me was, gee, Dad, thank you. I am so blessed to have your superior experience, insight, and understanding, and consider all of those hazards, which never, in my understandable excitement, had not crossed my mind. I am so indebted to you. You think that's what he said? No, he argued. And the end of the discussion was, because I'm your father, that's why. Okay. Okay. Now, I still have adult children, at least chronologically, they're adults. And I can't work miracles for them. I can't control them. I occasionally write a check, and it may seem like a miracle, but, those of you who have adult children know that it's not really the kind of miracle that you wish you could work in their lives. So let's contrast this with the emerging people Israel. I believe that the record we have in our Bible is our memory of the miracles that God worked for us in our spiritual infancy. Remember, I take the Bible seriously. I don't take it literally. I think when we were spiritually infants, we had this sense that God worked miracles for us, or at least the sense that's transmitted to us through our sacred texts is that God is working miracles. Remember, in the Talmud, they're going to get way far away from God's ability to work miracles. We can talk about that at length if you like. The correspondence to the toddlers is the book of Deuteronomy. If you read the book of Deuteronomy, in many places, it is very clear what the Torah is saying. If you obey my commandments, great things will happen to you. If you disobey my commandments, horrible things will happen to you. And when I say horrible, horrible doesn't capture it. There are places where in Deuteronomy it says, if you disobey my commandments, you will be so hungry that parents will fight over the corpse of their children to allow them to eat the dead flesh of their children. That's how bad things get. Deuteronomy, simple yet horrible. If you obey, good things will happen to you. If you disobey, bad things will happen to you, just like the toddler. If you play in the street, you're going to get hit by a car. In the book of Job, again, a fascinating book, all these horrible things happen to Job, and Job's friends come to console him. With friends like this, you don't need enemies. They probably, well, anyway, they console him with the following idea, with Deuteronomy. They say to Job, look, these horrible things have happened to you, therefore you must have sinned. So if you repent and acknowledge your sins, God will forgive you and good things will happen to you. Job refuses to go along with this because Job knows he hasn't sinned. So Job, in a fit of chutzpah, demands that God show up as judge, jury, and defendant in the trial of Job versus God. And God does, and gives some of the greatest speeches in the Bible, basically concluding with, I'm God, you're not. Where were you when I created the universe? Where were you? Do you know where I store the storehouses of snow and water in the heavens, and so on and so on and so on? Leading to a somewhat unsatisfactory apparent conclusion with God saying, look, a very important thing that God says is that your friends are wrong. God doesn't exactly explain it, but God says that Job's friends who explained it in simple Torah logic, Deuteronomy logic, are wrong. It's not as simple as if you do good things will happen to you. If you do bad things will happen to you. And scholars believe the book of Job is written to counteract this rather simple notion. And so what I would say is these days, I view my relationship with God as analogous in many ways, certainly not all ways, as the relationship between an adult parent and an adult child. And this, no doubt, as I think about it, is influenced by, I had a very good relationship with my parents as an adult, and I hope my children feel like their relationship with me is good. Can't work miracles, can't control them, but there's value in the communication, in advice, in understanding, in arguing. There's value in that, and I believe that's true of God and humanity at this stage. So people will often say, what about religious wars as an argument? And we often hear that the claims of the worst horrors, the worst wars were fought in the name of religion. It's simply not true. World War II resulted in the death of some 66 million people. Communism alone murdered more than 100 million people. Stalin, 20 million people. Communist China, 65 million people. By contrast, the Inquisition, which is often pointed to in this context, in its 400 years of existence, only, with that in quotes, murdered 5,000 people, which was about a half of a day's murder at Auschwitz. And if you want the back up for this, there is a book which I don't suggest as a gift to someone. It's called The Great Big Book of Horrible Things. It talks about the 100 worst atrocities in history. So, for example, the Crusades, which are clearly religious, ranks number 30 with 3 million deaths, about 0.7% of the preceding 29 incidents. The total deaths attributed to religious conflicts were about 19% of the total. And another quote from this encyclopedia, they found that less than 10% of the 1,180 conflicts in history involved religion at all. So I can't remember did I talk about the blind and the elephant in this class? Okay, so let me skip. So does God care? For me, this is a true leap of faith, notwithstanding the eclipse. I don't find compelling evidence for or against God caring. But in my own life, so this is autobiographical, by my consciously assuming, and we talked about this, I have like an afternoon discussion group. For me, it's a conscious discipline. I am consciously forcing myself to act as though God cares, and I need to respond to God's caring, which is to God's commandment. So by consciously assuming that God cares, and this record of caring is in revealed religious text, I bring myself into an amazing world of relationships among people, even people across the country, those of you who I would never meet except as a result of my chosen career and your interest in it, and with God. As a result, I find my life enriched and more beautiful and meaningful, and I have had the great privilege of helping others. In the words of our Passover liturgy, Dayenu, it's enough for me. I can live without the certainty on these issues. If it helps me, it helps others. And as we'll see in another slide, it's not irrational. It's enough for me. So this is where I am. In deciding to live a religious life, I make two leaps of faith. That God, the organizing intelligence in the universe, exists. This one is easy for me since, for me, the science is compelling. And the second one, which is a pure leap of faith, is that this God cares. I think I talked about earlier the four models of the relationship between science and faith. Conflict, that 6 days or 13 billion years can't be both. Independence, science is talking about stuff over here, religion is talking about stuff over here. Dialogue, their intention with each other, or integration. So I go even beyond integration. For me, I believe that science and religion need each other. I don't believe science and religion, either science and religion, can successfully do their jobs without the other. So Einstein said, science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind, and I would go further. Religion needs science. If the purpose of religion is to make the world a better place, this is especially emphasized in Judaism as tikkun olam, then we better understand how the world works to improve it. That's science. If I'm sick, pray for me. Knock your socks out. Pray a Misha Berach. You know, those are my friends who are Catholic. You know, pray Hail Marys. Pray your heart out. But help me get to a doctor. Okay? I believe God has given us the wisdom to intercede and intervene. And so I value prayer. And I think there's really interesting examples of prayer actually working. I can talk about that if there's interest. But I want to depend on science. And maybe slightly more controversial, more of a reach, but not for me, is that science needs religion. If science is to achieve its goal of expanding our understanding of the world around us and make improvements in our way of living, I would say that's the role of science. Humanity had better survive the risks of nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare by learning and living by the ethical rules taught by religions. Science and technology are amoral. A knife can be used to murder or heal. With the advent of nuclear weapons, the ability to damage is unlimited. Each thermonuclear bomb in our stockpiles today has the power, the explosive power, of all the explosions in all prior wars of history. Scientists estimate, I don't know if this estimate is true, that 100 thermonuclear explosions would end life as we know it on this planet, and it may be that the cockroaches would survive, or you know, creatures at the bottom of the sea might survive. The US and Russia together have some 10,000 such warheads today, significantly down from the 80s, but still more than enough to wipe out humanity. I believe, this is a belief of mine, you can believe, you know, have other beliefs. The only barrier to the use of such weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is religious ethics. And we do have problems with religious fundamentalists who might want to use these weapons of mass destruction. But I would say the only barrier is religious ethics. So a world of scientific progress unchecked by religious ethics leads to mass murder, that we saw at Auschwitz. Auschwitz got the cost of murdering people down to less than half a penny per life, and probably our extinction of species, and possibly the extinction of all species. So here are my bottom lines. There is nothing irrational about belief in God and about the belief that God cares about us. If we live our life as though God exists and cares, our lives are better and the world is better. If we are to survive and thrive, we better study both science and religion, and Dayenu. So before, I'm just going to show this so I can just conclude the PowerPoint. The next class, which starts 1 week from tonight, is a class in Taste of Judaism, 3 sessions on as an overview. Again, beginning a week from tonight, 7 o'clock Pacific time, and then a class in Jewish literacy will continue for an additional 15 sessions. Since I'm supported by the Jewish Federation of Ventura County, I don't have to charge for these classes, and you can sign up on the website. And again, the classes down under the description of the class, you can click there. And that is the end of what I wanted to say in terms of PowerPoint. So thank you for your attention and comments, questions.
Well, Rabbi, first of all, what do you mean by, what is it meant by Jewish literacy?
Jewish literacy, oh.
What does that encompass?
That's a great question. What I would say is adult, insightful learning about the critical elements that constitute Judaism. For example, now Larry, you come to a lot of stuff, so you've heard me talk about this ad nauseum. But most Jews, and I would say almost no non-Jews except for theologian non-Jews, understand that our religion is not the religion of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians would call the Old Testament. Our religion is the religion of the Talmud. And the rabbis crafted the Talmud, you know, in roughly the year 400 to 500. I would say it's really inauthentic to describe yourself as a literate Jew and not understand that. The other aspect of that is it's the whys behind things in Judaism. So, for example, I often tell the story, and Howard, Rabbi Leibson, I don't know if you've had similar experience, at a bar mitzvah, where I might explain that the origin of the central prayer of every service, the Amidah, is what the rabbis created to take the place of animal sacrifice. Instead of having animal sacrifice 3 times a day, we recite this prayer. And on at least 2 occasions, the grandfather of the bar mitzvah boy or girl came up to me afterwards in tears, saying, I was raised Orthodox, may still be Orthodox, and I've been praying this prayer every day of my life, 3 times a day, since I was 3 years old. No one ever told me why. Now, is that person literate in Judaism? It's a very interesting question, because he knows the service far better than I do, because he's been praying a lot more complete and complex service than I do. He probably knows a lot of laws of keeping kosher and so on more than I do, but may not be exposed to the underlying reasons and rationale. So in this class, and by going to the same website, you can see the syllabus. So the class is usually a mix of people who are interested in conversion, and also people who are just interested in broadening their knowledge about Judaism. And it's, I will say, you know, as a way of, in words of caution, this is how I got hooked. I think, as you know, Larry, I took this class when I was in my mid-30s, and it led to what Richard Jackman describes as adult onset Judaism. So although I was born a Jew, I never really took it seriously until I was exposed to the depth and wisdom and intricacies. I mean, most of us are educated in Judaism to the ripe old age of 13. Or if we're really super serious, we stay on till we're 15 or 16. And then we kind of walk away with the underlying assumption that Judaism specifically and religion in general is childish. Well, by definition, that which you only study as a child is childish. And if you only study religion or Judaism when you're a child, you can't get exposed. Believe me, nowhere in Hebrew school did I ever get exposed to the questions of theodicy, of how could God allow bad things to happen to good people? That's, how can you take the idea of God seriously without grappling with that question? So in a rather large nutshell, that's what I hope to cover. And the syllabus is on there, and one advantage is I will be recording it. So if people have to miss classes, they can easily catch up. That's the first time I've had the opportunity to do that. I've always taught this live. Rachel.
Yeah, would you discuss that time dilation, please?
Okay, so let me ask if there are other general questions, and I'll be happy to discuss time dilation.
Yeah, do you care if you have a ham sandwich?
Do I care?
Yeah.
Or does God care?
Does God care about a ham sandwich?
That's not part of my belief. But I believe God does care whether I'm kind to people or rotten to people.
Kind of pigs.
So my take on the difference between Reform Judaism and other forms of Judaism is I believe Reform Judaism insists that that Jews are bound by ethical commandments, the commandments relating to how we treat one another, animals, and the environment. And for the commandments that are ritual, the ham sandwich, wearing a yarmulke, keeping a mezuzah on every doorpost, those are really questions between me and God. And I'm going to sort it out. Murray.
2 things. The thing about Cain's wife, I mean, you see all kinds of theories on the internet and everywhere. The one that I seem to like is just because the Bible says it created Adam and then Eve and Cain and Abel, it doesn't say that he wasn't doing stuff outside of the Garden of Eden, which apparently if Cain had a wife, well, then I guess he was doing other stuff. It just didn't make the cut. The second thing was, could you please put back on the slide about the Pardes?
Yes, let me. figure out how to do this. I may need, it's going to take me a second. Okay. Okay. Whoops. Yeah, let me hang on. This is what. Oh. Okay. Hey, there it is.
Thank you.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to take a screen grab.
Okay, okay, yeah. It's not so easy to find this. I had to look. Okay. Any other question? Time dilation. Everybody ready for time dilation?
Wait, Rabbi Lotker?
Yes.
This is Esther. One thing first. Wouldn't the idea of a God that cares be inherent in a God that created everything? After all, if that God's going to go through all the trouble to make us, I would think he would just care about what he made just because he made it. It's like Michelangelo, once he's finished a painting, he's going to care what happens to it.
I wouldn't disagree with that, but I think they're two separate leaps of faith. If I worship God as the laws of physics and, just am in awe of how beautifully the universe fits together and works together, and agree to use the word God for the organizing intelligence behind that, it's not inherent that God would care. But I think, I agree that God does care.
Well, don't forget, that's the same God that caused the flood, that killed everybody except for 8 people.
Right. And
So
I think so that's why I take the stories seriously, but not literally.
God does art. You would think that God would also have an eraser.
Yeah. So again, these are the mythological stories. There are flood stories in most mythologies, and we have one too. And our flood story deals with who is ethical and who is not ethical. But I think, I have huge problems with the flood story. I often say, what did the bunny rabbits do? And the rabbis will talk about, that the bunny rabbits were screwing turtles. I mean, I don't know, but that they were engaging in intra-species copulation. But I find that absurd. So the flood story is one of the stories which I find interesting, but I don't dwell on. I don't believe it ever happened, so I don't dwell on. Okay, let me spend a few minutes, actually, in our inertial reference frame on time dilation. Okay, here's the deal. The essential fundamental assumption in Einstein's special theory of relativity is that the speed of light as measured by anybody is exactly the same, okay? So let's say you're in a train going, let me explain why this is not obvious. Let's say you're in a train and you're going this way, right? Everybody with me? Okay. And you shoot a bullet, and let's say the train is moving 100 miles an hour. And I shoot an arrow. Let's not talk about a bullet. And I shoot an arrow in the same direction as the train is moving. So inside my train car, boing, I let the arrow go, and it flies off my bow at 100 miles an hour in the same direction as the train, right? Now you are standing on the station, and the train has a glass window, and you're measuring the speed of the arrow from your stationary spot. What's the speed?
You would think that they would add.
Yeah, they would. They would. There's no question about this. You're moving 100 miles an hour this way. The arrow is moving 100 miles an hour faster than I'm moving. You are sitting on the station would measure the speed at 200 miles an hour, right? By the same token, if I shot the arrow in this direction at 100 miles an hour, as the train whizzed by, the arrow would apparently just stand in space and it would be zero. Everybody with me? What Einstein said, and you can experimentally verify, this is another 10 minutes of explanation about the Michelson-Morley experiment, if any of you know what that is. What Einstein proposed and has been experimentally confirmed is, let's take the exact same case. I'm in that train whizzing this way, and I measure the speed of light from my flashlight. And the speed of light is a number called c. I think it's 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. Very fast. I measure it, and I get that number. Now, somebody on the train station measures it with great accuracy. You would think that they would measure it at c plus 100 miles an hour, right? But they don't. It turns out experimentally, the speed of light is independent of your reference inertial frame. Okay, everybody with me? Now take a deep breath, okay? Let's say same experiment. I'm on that train whizzing by at 100 miles an hour. And now I have a little ball. And inside my train, I'm gonna bounce the ball on the floor and up to my hand, or yo-yo. Not a yo-yo, a ball, okay? And it's gonna bounce. So inside my frame, the ball is traveling straight up and down, right? And let's say it travels 2 meters down, 2 meters up in 1 second. The speed of that ball is 2 meters per second. Everybody with me? Now, you see that ball from your vantage point, and the ball doesn't look like it's up and down because it's moving. So it's going to look like this, right? It's going to make a sawtooth. Everybody with me? So it's still going to bounce up and down in 1 second. Let's say 2 seconds down, 2 seconds up. But it's going to cover a greater distance, and sure enough, it's the speed of the train that's going to make the difference. Everybody with me? Take another deep breath. Now we'll say instead of a ball, it's a pulse of light bouncing up and down between 2 mirrors. Okay? And it's light, it turns out, this is a very useful fact, light moves about a meter in a nanosecond. Nanosecond is a billionth of a second. So we're going to have a meter down, meter up. It's going to be 2 nanoseconds. Okay? And everything's cool. Now we're going to move really close to the speed of light in this direction. I'm now not in a train, I'm in a rocket ship. So you're still sitting on the Earth, and you're not going to see it go this far in one nanosecond. You're going to see it go this far. You're going to see that light move much further in the same period of time. But the speed of light is a constant. So time has to slow down for all those things to remain. And sure enough, we have experimentally measured, when you put satellites in space and they're going really fast, we have measured the slowing down of time in those satellites, and you actually have to correct for it in GPS, because GPS is based on very precise time measurements, the time it takes for a radio pulse to get to you from a satellite. So you have to correct for time dilation. So what Schroeder is suggesting is 6 days in God's inertial reference frame, because who knows what speed God is moving at, might actually be 13 billion years in our inertial reference frame. For me, this entirely misses the point, because I don't take the 6 days seriously. I take it seriously. I don't take it literally at all. But I just want you to know, if you're clever enough and you use the insights of good Jewish physicists like Einstein, you can figure out how to make it all fit together. And that's your lesson on special relativity.
That was great. Now do general.
Thank you,
I'll do
Rabbi.
general relativity. Okay, here's a very brief lesson in general relativity. You're in an elevator, and the elevator starts moving up really quickly, and you're standing on a scale. Does your weight increase or decrease when the elevator starts going up really quickly?
Increase.
Okay.
Increase should be going, yeah, the weight.
So Einstein's insight in general relativity is that acceleration, once that elevator gets up to speed, you no longer feel that drag on you, right? Acceleration and gravity are interchangeable. And by the same token, if you're in that elevator and the cable is cut, in that brief moment while you're falling inside the elevator down the shaft, you are weightless. And in fact, you know how astronauts are weightless in the space station? Well, why should they be weightless? They're not that far from the Earth. Stop that space station's going to fall. Does this ever worry any of you?
Because they're falling.
Because they're falling. What they're literally doing, thank you, Ira, they are falling around the Earth. They're moving this way really fast, and they're falling down toward the center of the Earth. But by the time they get to here, the curvature of the Earth has receded, so they're still at the same altitude. That's what we mean by an orbit. So they are falling around the Earth. The other important element of general relativity, and I can't think of any clever way to explain it, which really is an indication that I don't deeply understand it, is that gravity affects the shape of space. So we know that light moves in a straight line, right? Laser moves in a straight line. If there's a big gravitational mass here, the space will be affected by the gravitational mass, and the light will actually curve. And if I go back to that eclipse, the light that passes close to the sun, because the sun has a lot of gravity, will bend. And there are stars that, behind the sun are close to the sun. During the daytime, we can't see them. But during a total eclipse, they become visible. And I think it was in 1918 or 1919, an expedition went to photograph the star field during the totality of the eclipse. And by measuring the distance between stars, they could see it was like, much less than a 1 degree bend in the starlight. And that experimentally proved Einstein's general relativity. And I may have shared this last time. My favorite quote from Einstein was, he then became world famous, the most well-known scientist in the world. And he was interviewed by a reporter, and the reporter asked him, Professor Einstein, suppose the experiment had shown you were wrong. And Einstein's reaction was, then I'd feel sorry for God because I know I'm right. That is ultimate chutzpah. Okay, don't ask me to explain quantum mechanics. Any other questions, comments?
Nope.
Okay, thank you. I hope you found it interesting.
Yes.
Extremely.
And something to think about. And again, I'm not necessarily...
Sorry, can
Yeah.
I have one quick comment?
Sure.
Sorry. I've just been thinking about the Milgram experiment.
Right.
So I have a limited experience when I was getting my master's with doing social science experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So 90% of the people that you do the experiments with using are students at the college. And I know that...
I don't think that was true with Milgram. I actually don't remember.
Okay, because I was going to say,
Cheryl,
I know that I'm pretty sure that my response would be different as a college student than it would be now. And I don't know, I was just wondering whether...
Yeah, I just don't know the answer. Cheryl, do you have any further insight on that one?
I mean, you are right that, cultural mores change, and predominantly when you use college students, they're much more compliant than when you're going to use other adults. And so Milgram did not, in the original experiment, use, you know, what we would do today in science of, you know, a more varied population. I mean, it wasn't like, well, we had so many African Americans and so many Asians, and you know, if you throw that into the mix, you're going to get, you know, different cultural influences that would change the experiment. And with people changing over time, and, you know, whatever, the Me Too movement, you know, people may look at you and say, are you out of your mind? I'm not going to do this.
But the interesting thing is, and I don't know when this was redone.
When it was redone, yes. When people ask the question of, could there be another Nazi Germany? Well, yes, go look at some other places in the world. It still exists. You know, of people doing horrible things to one another, all because of, you know, authoritarian, you respond to an authoritarian regime. If you become
tribalism.
If you become anonymous, you know, you give up that authority to someone else, and you'll do incredible things.
Yeah, it's worth taking. I was unaware of this being redone, and I've, you know, every time I give a talk like this, well, I won't say every time, but I look at it because there was a movie called The Experimenter, which is about Milgram. You can find it on Netflix, and it tells the story of his life and this experiment, and his career was severely damaged by this experiment because the results were horrific. He expected maybe 2 or 3% of people would go to the maximum voltage, and when 65% of people went to the maximum voltage, and this was published, I mean, people couldn't live with the conclusion. I don't blame them. I have trouble living with that conclusion. And I think he was denied tenure because of the experiment. So it's a very powerful lesson. And there are other lessons. If you want to Google something else, look at the Stanford experiment on obedience. I think
is this one true? Somebody told me, somebody asked Einstein, what does it feel like to be the smartest man in the world? And he says, I don't know, ask Tesla.
Oh, no, I haven't heard that, but I like it. Humility is not a bad thing. And on that humble note, I will give you my great thanks. Skona, you have something.
Yeah, this is just personal. I came 10, 15 minutes late today because I was somewhere else, and I want to watch the beginning of the class. When does it get posted? The recording gets posted to your website?
Yeah, it will probably be by tomorrow, possibly tonight.
Thank you so much.
It actually takes a while to download and upload, and
yeah, but within a day or so. Okay,
yeah,
great.
yes, within a day or so. Yeah,
I loved the class.
Okay, well, thank you all again.